The morning the whole fight really began was quiet in the way. A storm looks calm right before it tears a roof off the world, and I was standing on the edge of my land watching the sun lift itself over the line of pines that framed my 30-acre property, a place my father built by hand, and a place I had sworn to protect no matter what. And with each breeze that rolled down the valley you could almost hear the land breathe, like it had its own pulse, its own stubborn heartbeat, reminding me of everything my family sacrificed to keep it untouched. I lived far away from town, a little too far for most people, but perfect for me, with no neighbors, no traffic, no rules, and definitely no HOA. But that changed the moment Karen arrived, a woman shaped by pure entitlement, with hair sprayed so stiff it looked like it was ready for hurricane season, and a voice that cracked glass. Every time she screeched about rules, regulations, and whatever nonsense gave her a sense of power, and she rolled into the valley with a clipboard the size of a medieval shield and a belief so unshakable that she was the rightful queen of everything she saw, including my land, which she did not own and had no authority over, but that never stopped her from trying. It all started when she marched onto my driveway uninvited, wearing oversized sunglasses and a fake smile so sharp it could cut steel, and she began her classic opening speech about community standards, even though this was not a community, and her newly formed micro HOA was nothing more than a group of 3 retired friends who got bored enough to crown themselves rulers of the valley. And she informed me that she had drafted new property appearance guidelines, and that my old barn, my tractor shed, my firewood stacks, and even the color of my porch were in violation of her imaginary rules. I stared at her for a long moment, wondering if she was joking, but the seriousness in her eyes made it clear she fully believed she had the power to tell me how to live on land my family owned 4 generations. And I told her politely to leave, but she puffed up like a peacock and said I needed to comply or face consequences, which made me laugh harder than I should have. And that was the moment she snapped and declared war. Within a week she pushed harder and harder, sending threatening letters, taping notices to my gate, and even attempting to fine me for not attending HOA meetings that were held at a country club I had never set foot in, and definitely never agreed to be part of. And every time she drove by, she slowed down, looked at my property like she was assessing it for auction, and acted like she could not wait to tear something down. That week, I caught her taking pictures of my barn, zooming in like she was gathering evidence for a court case, and I told her again she was trespassing, but she responded by threatening to call the sheriff, which she actually did. And when the sheriff showed up, he already knew her reputation and told her clearly and loudly that I was outside her jurisdiction and she had no authority here. But that only fueled her anger even more, and she stormed off, swearing that she would escalate things and that I would regret disrespecting her title as HOA president, which meant absolutely nothing in the middle of farmland. Everything would have ended right there, but Karen escalated beyond anything I thought possible, because she hired contractors without my consent and ordered them to tear down what she labeled illegal structures, and they showed up on my land unannounced at 8 in the morning, with equipment loaded on trailers, ready to work. And I walked out calmly, even though inside I felt the rage boiling, and I asked who sent them, and the foreman said the HOA president told them this land belonged to the community, and that the barn needed to go. I almost could not believe what I was hearing, and I told them to get off my land before they ruined their lives. But Karen showed up right behind them, screaming that she had authority and that they should start demolition immediately, and she tried to cite laws that did not exist, waving a stack of forged documents she printed on her home computer, and I knew then she had lost all sense. The contractors backed out quickly once they realized she had no power here, and she began yelling at them, calling them cowards, incompetents, and threats to community order. And she was so loud even the birds flew off in annoyance, and I thought that was the end of it. But later that afternoon my water pressure suddenly dropped to nothing, and when I checked the line that ran underground, I discovered the pipe had been dug up and ripped apart, deliberately, cut with tool marks clear as day. And I knew instantly who did it, because Karen had warned me earlier she could shut down utilities to force compliance. My land, my water, my property, and she dared to destroy it, believing she had the upper hand. And that was the moment the switch flipped inside me, and I decided to end this war once and for all. And I walked to the lockbox by the old shed, opened my padlocked cabinet, and pulled out the thick metal key to the main industrial valve that fed the entire upper valley, including Karen's newly purchased cluster of cabins which her HOA members had built illegally on land still under legal review, and those cabins relied fully on the same waterline she thought she controlled. If she wanted to play hardball, I was going to show her exactly how stupid her decision was, because the main valve was on my land and legally under my authority. And I walked across the field, hearing the crunch of dry leaves under my boots, feeling each step, carrying a sense of justice, and I reached the valve, the steel wheel, sitting under a shelter of rusted metal, and I gave it one long, steady turn, and the heavy pipes moaned deep underground, like an old animal waking from sleep, and the entire water flow to the valley shut off instantly. Within minutes, texts and calls started blowing up my phone, but I ignored them and went back to my porch, sitting calmly on my rocking chair sipping sweet tea as chaos erupted downhill, and soon I saw the dust cloud of Karen's SUV racing toward my property like a charging bull ready to flip over anything in her path, and she slammed the brakes at my gate, jumped out, and ran toward me, waving her arms, screaming that the neighborhood had no water, and that I needed to fix it immediately or she would have me arrested for domestic terrorism. I almost laughed, but her face was red enough to glow in the sunlight, and she demanded I reopen the valve, but I just leaned back and explained in a calm, steady voice that she herself destroyed my water line, and that, until it was repaired properly, the entire system could not run, and she lost her mind, screaming that I was sabotaging the community, and that she would take me to court and seize my property. But before she could finish, we heard sirens echoing down the valley. The sheriff arrived again, along with 2 deputies, and Karen ran to them, pointing at me, accusing me of shutting down an entire subdivision and endangering families and causing chaos. But the sheriff knew her well, and he already looked exhausted as he asked me what happened, and I told him everything, from the trespassing to the forged documents to the attempted demolition to the destruction of my water line. And the sheriff asked Karen if she had really ordered contractors onto land she did not own, and her silence spoke everything. But it was not silence for long, because she exploded in a tantrum, claiming she was doing her duty as HOA president, and she reached into her purse to pull out more fake papers, waving them wildly until one deputy politely took them and shook his head, saying none of this was legal. And the sheriff finally told Karen she was under investigation, and she began screaming about injustice, corruption, sabotage, and that the valley belonged to her authority alone, and that everyone would someday thank her for her leadership. The sheriff sighed deeply, placed her in handcuffs, and Karen screamed louder than a car alarm echoing across the valley as she was placed in the back of the deputy's SUV, which rocked slightly from her kicking the door. And as she continued yelling, she promised she would be back and she would finish what she started. But as they drove away, I knew this battle was far from over, because people like Karen do not give up, they escalate. And I was right, because 2 days later something much bigger happened. Something that would reshape the valley reputation forever, and it all started with a single letter, dropped off at my gate, stamped with the government's seal. The letter sat on my gate like a warning written by fate itself, stamped with the federal emblem that only appears when something serious has finally reached the eyes of people with real power. And as I opened it, the wind rustled through the pine trees, sending a long whisper across the valley, as if nature already knew what was coming. And inside the envelope was a notice stating that Karen and her so-called HOA were being investigated for land fraud, illegal development, and unlawful attempts to impose governance on territories outside their jurisdiction, which meant everything she built, everything she claimed, and every power she pretended to have was being torn down piece by piece. I knew Karen would not take this quietly, and the valley seemed too tense, as if the ground itself braced for the chaos she would unleash next. And sure enough, 3 days later, before sunrise, I heard engines growling on the far side of my property, and when I stepped onto my porch, the horizon glowed faintly, with headlights moving in formation like a convoy preparing for war. And it was Karen's people, her last remaining loyalists, the ones she brainwashed into believing she was saving the valley from imagined ruin. They marched onto my land carrying boxers, cameras, clipboards, and illegal notices, as if they still believed they could enforce anything here. And their leader, a tall man with a desperate look, yelled that they were here to secure community assets, which included my barn, my tools, my equipment, my wellhouse, and even my livestock. And I felt the anger return heavier than before, because they were no longer just trespassing, they were attempting a full-scale takeover asterisk. I grabbed my phone not to call the sheriff but to record everything, because I wanted no loose ends, no missed details, and no chance for Karen to twist the truth again. And as I walked toward them, the leader demanded I step back and comply with community seizure orders, and I told him calmly that he was trespassing, and that his orders were as fake as Karen's authority. But he kept shouting that the HOA had voted unanimously to absorb my land into the community, and that refusal to comply would result in penalties, arrests, and legal action. Asterisk. That was when I saw movement near the tree line, a familiar sheriff's SUV driving fast but silent through the dirt path, and they got out with urgency in their steps, and the sheriff walked straight toward the group, his hand resting near his belt, not in threat, but in warning, and the sheriff demanded everyone stop what they were doing and produce legal documentation, which none of them had because there with no legal basis for anything they were doing. Asterisk. The leader tried to read from a sheet of paper, shaking nervously, but the sheriff cut him off, saying the county had already voided every HOA action and had issued a temporary restraining order against Karen, her board, and anyone acting under her command, and the loyalists froze, confused, scared, unsure, and finally defeated because everything they believed was collapsing in front of them, and the sheriff told them they had two choices: leave peacefully or be charged with criminal trespass and attempted theft of property. Asterisk. One by one, the loyalists backed away, their courage draining faster than water from a broken pipe, and they retreated down the valley, leaving nothing but tire tracks and embarrassment behind them. And the sheriff turned to me, shaking his head and saying Karen had filed appeals, threats, complaints, and even tried to report the sheriff's office for corruption, but none of it worked, and she was growing more unhinged by the day. Asterisk. But the storm had one more roar left. Asterisk. Because that evening, just as the sun dipped below the ridge and the sky turned a deep orange, I heard another engine, but this one was not from a car. It was low, powerful, and rumbling, like a machine built for destruction, and I realized with disbelief that Karen was driving a bulldozer straight toward my property line, the same bulldozer her group had illegally rented using forged documents, and she was screaming out the open cab that she would reclaim community land by force and erase all defiance from the valley. Asterisk. Her hair whipped wildly in the wind, her sunglasses crooked, her expression twisted into something between fury and madness, and she pressed the accelerator down hard, causing the massive machine to surge forward, crushing saplings as it rolled, and she shouted that the barn would fall, that the land would be restored, and that I would finally learn respect for authority. And she looked like a villain in an old Western movie, fueled by ego and pure chaos. Asterisk. I did not run, I did not yell, I simply walked to the main electrical off that powered the external fence, and flipped the emergency cutoff switch, and then I grabbed the old chain that hung on the side, hooking it into the heavy steel anchor points on the ground, because I knew exactly what would happen next. And as the bulldozer approached the boundary, Karen screamed for me to move, but her voice was no longer commanding, it was frantic, desperate, cracking under the weight of her own delusion. Asterisk. She pushed the throttle again, and the bulldozer hit the reinforced boundary chain with incredible force, and the entire machine jolted backward, shaking violently as the chain wrapped itself across the front guard, like a metal whip, stopping Karen exactly where her madness peaked, and the engine sputtered before stalling out, smoke rising from the front vents, and Karen stumbled inside the cab, stunned, confused, unable to process how her dramatic final strike had failed so miserably. Asterisk. Then the red and blue lights came again, but brighter this time, because this time it was not just the local sheriff's office, it was 2 county units and a federal investigator who stepped out with a folder thick enough to end careers. And as they approached the bulldozer, Karen began screaming that she was protecting the community, that she was enforcing law, that she was saving lives from dangerous, unapproved structures, and that everyone was conspiring against her. Asterisk. But the investigator cut her off, stating she was under arrest for multiple counts, including property destruction, attempted unlawful demolition, fraud, impersonation of authority, misuse of county resources, harassment, trespassing, and several additional charges still being filed. And Karen's face contorted as the weight of reality finally fell on her shoulders, and she attempted to run, but the deputies were faster, and they guided her to the ground and secured her hands behind her back as she shouted empty threats into the dirt. Asterisk. As they placed her in the back of the vehicle, she screamed that she would be back, that she would rebuild the HOA, that she would reclaim the valley, and that I would never live peacefully again. But her words were drowned by the sound of the door slamming shut and the investigator handed me a documented acknowledgement stating I had been the victim in every recorded incident, and that the department would pursue full restitution once the case closed. The bulldozer was towed away, the loyalists vanished from the valley, the forged HOA dissolved permanently, and for the first time in months, the land breathed easy again, and I walked back to my porch, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders, and as night fell, I sat in my rocking chair listening to the quiet rustle of the wind rolling through the pines. As the stars returned to their rightful glow, no longer dimmed by the chaos Karen brought with her asterisk. But the story did not end there, because months later, after trial hearings, depositions, and endless paperwork, I received a settlement letter stating that Karen had been ordered to pay full restitution for the damage to my water line, my property, my legal expenses, and even the disruption she brought into the valley, and since she could not afford the full judgment, the county seized the illegal cabins her HOA had built and put them up for auction, and in one of the greatest twists of karma wrapped in poetic justice, I bought every single one of those cabins for a fraction of their value and added them to my land, expanding the property my father built, turning what once was used against me into something I now owned fully and legally, and the valley finally returned to peace under my watch, with no HOA, no Karen, no forged rules, no bulldozers, and no chaos. Just land, sky, freedom, and the quiet reminder that the loudest tyrants always fall hardest. And that is how the valley survived the reign of HOA Karen, and how her attempt to control everything ended with her losing everything, and how my land remained exactly what it was, meant to be free, untouched, and forever mine.